In this class, we're going to be looking at property theory and the customary interest. And our purpose is to look at the origin of the law and the way that the law impacts on various cultures' understanding of property and the appropriate way to deal with it. To begin with, we're going to look at the origin of custom with Indigenous people. You may have already been aware that when you speak to an Indigenous person about their property, they will just about immediately start talking about their spirituality. And that is because there's this key nexus between the people and their land. In fact, we can see three things that are typically made or created simultaneously in just about all of the Genesis stories, the creation myths of Indigenous people. And the three things are these: the people, the land, and the laws and customs that connect the people together and also connect them to their land. The laws and customs provide an entire way of life, and they also define the relationships between people and people in their land. In this way, Indigenous people cannot simply separate their land property in the way that Western people can, because to be separated from their property is to be separated really from their culture and their customs in a way that Western people can't understand. Let's look at the creative events that are a core to all Indigenous people. Just about every creation narrative from Indigenous communities has to do with either a creator spirit or a creating event, sometimes without a conscious deity. And as a result of that creative action, either from the God, the creator spirit, or the creative event, the people, the land, and the laws are all generated. Usually with the people being given their laws and customs, and amongst the laws and customs are their history, their stories, their explanation for where the land came from. And these are often rich in symbolism and metaphor, and they have considerable meaning, not just in terms of an interpretation for how things came to be made, but also in terms of current practice, how people should behave today. Because the land and the people were initially made as a result of one creative event, the connection between them is as intimate to their very existence. This is very hard for Western people to appreciate. But what it means is that the people see the land as connected to them uniquely and completely, perhaps given to them by a creative spirit to give them a place to live and supply their food and their clothing and their shelter and so on, also as a place of special significance because it reminds them of their creation stories. We would describe this connection as a metaphysical connection. Metaphysics is that science that deals with reflections on the way that existence works, what things have to do to exist. The metaphysics of Indigenous people is fundamentally different to the metaphysics of Western people, and we'll be exploring that later. Suffice to say at this point, we can say that because of this intimate connection that comes from the creation event, that there is this metaphysical being, the very what it is to be a person, has to do with a connection to the land, in much the same way that we have, if you like, a necessary connection to our neck or our lungs or our heart. If you take them away from us, we cannot live. Now, in our scientific outlook, we might say, yes, you can take the land away from people and they can still live. However, for Indigenous people, it is a bit like taking out your lungs or your heart. Now, the creation event also provides a very handy legal solution to what in the West has been a growing problem, and that's the problem of the root of title. The tribe's land is connected to them because they were connected at the very beginning of existence. And so the root of title goes back to the creation event. And this is why, when you speak to people, Indigenous people, about their land, they will speak to you about their creation story, because that is what gives them their land. The nature of the relationship is a total and unbreakable connection. It's social because it is not only something which is intimately connected, but it's also connected on condition of the laws. Remember, the laws and customs were also the result of the creation event. And so those laws and customs have to do with how to appropriately treat others. Now, these appropriate relations, these customs and laws, typically focus on the treatment of others in the tribe. Now, this is very, very important because there is usually a boundary set between members of the tribe and other people. And to a certain extent, other people do not have the same rights, the same metaphysical connection. They just popped up somewhere else as a result of some other creation event. Perhaps looked after by other creative spirits and certainly having other laws and customs. And so one of the important things about tribal approaches is that they are tribal, that their boundaries are the boundaries of the bloodlines of the tribe. And you see this very often in the way that one way or another, strangers or foreigners have to be symbolically inducted into the tribe in order to be able to have any sort of a relationship. This is most evident when it comes to marriage relationships, but it is also a common feature often when Indigenous people attempt to have commercial relationships with outsiders. You have to be one way or another welcomed in, become an adopted brother of the tribe, so to speak, because it's really only members of the tribe that the tribal laws and customs apply to. We'll see this recurring not just in today's Indigenous people, but also in the tribalism that we find in history. There is an unfortunate narrowness that often comes as a result of this limitation that you find with tribal rights. Because others are excluded, in some places this produces considerable problems, especially as outsiders. We often fail to distinguish that there are separate tribes and separate creation stories, separate entire systems of custom and so on, existing in what appear to an outsider to be very, very similar people. For instance, in the Fijian Islands, which we see as one country, often there are people that are completely disenfranchised as a result of the fact that they have left their traditional island and come to work either in the main island of Fiji or maybe in some other island. But even though they are native Fijians, they do not have any rights in their new home because their new home is not connected to them through these traditional stories and so on. We find this very much in New Guinea, but also on the Australian mainland. One way or another, European culture has tended to transcend the tribal boundaries. And we see this especially in New Guinea, where the coming of the patrol officers as the government officials through Fiji were known, was seen as a great step forward because they were able to set a standardised set of relationships across the entire country. And this meant that one tribe didn't have to live in fear of those tribes around them because the patrol officers ensured that there was a law that applied to all New Guineans. And this was a great step forward because previous to that there was cannibalism and almost continual warfare. This intimate connection that exists in Indigenous communities can be contrasted to the modern Western approach to land property. In Western political and social thought, the distinction that the government has, contrasted to all other individuals and entities in a community, is that the government is the only entity in a society, in a Western society, that has the licit power to do violence to others. It has the authority to coerce. We accept that because it's very, very useful. It's very useful if we have bank robbers who policemen are able to run down and put into prison, or possibly even in extreme cases to be able to put to death. This right to coerce is something that private individuals do not have. This right to coerce is quite important when it comes to the question of land law, because this perception that the positive reality of a government is that it has the authority to coerce, and therefore to be able to stop people who might be inclined to do antisocial things through the fear of the violence that the government is able to apply to them, is applied to the convention of land ownership. In the modern West, we don't have a creation narrative which intimately connects people with their land. What we have to do is rely on laws to achieve that. And so modern Western capitalist free market economies have to rely on the government to supply the laws and principles for the convention of private property. And this is because private property in the West is always a convention. It is an arbitrary set of laws that are adopted because they're considered by the particular community to be the most appropriate. And if you misbehave, you don't respect those rights of property, the government has the authority and the resources to be able to do some sort of violence to you, to put you into prison or something else. Now that works very well in terms of keeping people driving on the correct side of the road, or perhaps not breaking into banks and so on. However, it has a curious application to the question of land property. In the case of land property in Australia, the root of title is the prior ownership of the state. And so we assume that all of our land comes because the government, or the Crown, gives it to us. Now this implicitly assumes that the government is the first owner of the land. We can ask ourselves, why is it that the Australian government does own all of the land of Australia? And we find that formally the answer to that question is because Captain Cook took possession of all of the land in Australia by planting a flag on an island named Possession Island up off the Queensland coast as he sailed round on his voyages of exploration. And it is that one act, an arbitrary act which the indigenous people nearby certainly didn't understand, they certainly didn't understand the authority of it, the power of it, is what has given all Australian states their ultimate right to land and their right then to pass it on, to grant it to individuals. And so our root of title is grounded on the idea of the private ownership of the state. And it's only a conventional authority, a conventional set of rights. And of course this is what the indigenous people have been complaining about for the last 2 centuries, because they would say that it wasn't something that you simply pick up in the same way that you might pick up a pebble off the beach that no one owns. The government was actually taking possession of something that did belong to other people. However, we're getting ahead of ourselves. The important thing at this point is to see that modern Western land property relies on the coercive power of the government and an arbitrary act which brought to the government all of the land of Australia. The nature of the relationships of modern Western land property are purely conventional. They are defined sets of rights. And what this means is it's a matter of which rights to the land the government chooses to connect to individual people. And this arbitrary connection is important. Really, we don't own land. We simply have the legal authority to benefit from certain distinct rights. And so the land rights that we have are those that the government tends to, or has chosen, to define as freehold or leasehold, whatever our tenure is. We find that that becomes apparent in the case of mining, where you may own a farm. However, as a farm owner, you don't own the minerals. Somebody else can have those minerals. And so they might have a mining lease which comes from the government and in fact doesn't displace your rights at all, except when the mining equipment tends to get in the way of your cows or sheep or something. This defined set of rights is very, very important because it means that they've got to do with your material enjoyment of the land, your use of the land. not actually your intimate ownership in the way that the indigenous people see themselves as intimately connected. And so in the diagram here, we're showing that the connection between people and the land is not direct. It's rather linked through the links of the laws. It is to do with material connection, and so material quantities can always or usually be quantified with money. And most of our property rights have to do with the economic control of the wealth which is associated with land use. The focus in Western land property is the exclusion of others from enjoying your particular piece of property. This is very different from the indigenous perspective, where the beginning is the connection, and given that that connection is total and unable to be broken, the indigenous person tends to have little difficulty in allowing others some degree of access and use to their property, because after all, the property is intimately connected to them. They're not going to lose it. They're simply entertaining a visitor, and it's considered to be good hospitality, quite neighbourly. However, in the West, that social dimension, which indigenous people tend to have, partly because of the metaphysics of their ownership, but also partly because of their customs, tends to be almost turned on its head, because the Western user is preoccupied with exclusive occupation. And we have laws of trespass to keep people out, to exclude them. And this anti-social dimension is very, very important in the understanding of modern Western land property, because the rights are really determined in terms of what other people are prevented from being able to do. Formally speaking, modern Western land property is accidental. And by accidental, we're using the philosophical meaning of the term there. An accident is a characteristic which something happens to have, but it does not need to have. I might wear spectacles. People don't need to wear spectacles, and I don't need to wear them, I guess. I just happen to. That's an accident. It's the same way that you might look at a dog, and it might be a spotty dog, or it might be a black dog, or a white dog. It doesn't have to be a particular colour to be a dog. It's simply an accident. It's an accidental quality of the dog to have the particular colour. Likewise, it's an accidental quality of Western people to have land. It's simply something that you may have or may not have. It doesn't really matter. It doesn't affect you. It doesn't affect you essentially. Largely, the convention of private property that we adopt in the West is validated conceptually because it leads to a just allocation of rights and considered to be a method of creating a superior level of economic efficiency. And all of these things are fairly well tried in history. And many people have heard the jokes about the way that company cars don't need to have the oil changed, or they never need to be washed and so on, because when things are totally shared, people tend not to care for them very well. Whereas if you own something personally and privately, you tend to care for it considerably better. And so there certainly is this economic efficiency which is associated with property rights and private property rights. In the case of land property, this is especially the case when, in many cases, the effort that I might put in today into my property is something that I definitely own because it's part of my effort, my work, myself. However, I might be planting seeds today, expecting corn to grow and be able to feed my family in 6 months' time. I need private property rights in order to make sure that the corn I harvest feeds my family and is not simply taken by somebody else who comes onto my property and decides to eat well without ever actually working. And so the economic justification of private property is very well established. The Convention of Western Property Law, which is current in Australia, has been derived from English land law. And the reason that the government is seen to be the ultimate landowner goes back to practices which are literally centuries and centuries old, millennia old, in England, where, going back to feudal times, the notion was that the king, the government representative, the top of the government pyramid, was the ultimate owner of the land. And he then gave the land to his lower lords in exchange for rent. And they then gave their land, subdivided it if you like, allocated it to others who actually worked it as tenants. And there was this chain of ownership going from the king, who was the ultimate owner, down through a number of intermediate levels of tenancy. And at each level there was authority delegated, but also obligations flowing back towards the king. And in very early feudal times, these were in terms of money rent, usually only a minor part of the benefit, raw materials, and manpower. And the manpower often included military service. So this feudal system has this ancient heritage. The original feudal system was a highly complex system of rights and obligations and extended far past property rights. And it was a part of a social fabric that was this matrix of social obligations and social rights from a time when the English community was far more integrated, shall we say, far more social use of the land, because the rent from the land was able to support the entire community. In the earliest times, there was very little, in fact negligible, need for separate taxes. The social logic of the feudal system is rather curious, because the lord or king is considered as a patriarch. The rent income comes with considerable obligation. Largely the modern mind has lost a sensitivity for this, but the obligations of the king were quite considerable. The king was expected to ride at the head of the army in defence of the kingdom. The king was also expected to support the kingdom through the provision of a certain degree of infrastructure, and also to make sure that law and order was kept in place. And all of these things were supported by the land rent that flowed up to the king through the feudal hierarchy. Generally, the feudal system in ancient times was quite effective, but of course, like any other system populated by human beings, there was the occasional rogue lord or poor king. The problem for the feudal system in early times, let's say back around the time of the Magna Carta, was problems with middle management. The difficulty was that those intermediate lords were able to see all of this rent coming to them from their tenants, who did all the work. The middle management lords were quite fond of all the money they were getting, but not very fond at all of how much they had to pass up line to the king. And so this rebellion from the middle management has tended to come down to us as an historic rejection of the benefits of the feudal system, to the point that the feudal system is largely taken apart in the modern understanding, certainly with the widespread distribution of freehold these days. There is an alternative approach to land law, though, which occasionally happens in different countries, not in England. And this is the allocation of what's known as allodial property. Feudal property, we've explained, comes from this hierarchy where the crown, the king, is the highest and ultimate landowner. Allodial property is where land rights simply exist. And under a allodial property system, the government simply administers the property rights which it recognises coming from various sources. In an allodial system, you can have the government creating property rights, and that works in a way which looks fairly similar to the feudal system. And there has been certain calls for Australia to move towards an allodial property system, because the feudal history is now seen to be quite irrelevant in the Australian context. All of this has to do with history, allodial systems and feudal systems and so on. But behind the practice, there is also the justification of why we use a particular convention. Why is it that we have the feudal system, or what benefits did it have? Was it a just system or not? what we find is that modern property theory rests on the theoretical developments of a number of key thinkers back through time. Now, for our purposes, we'll simply look at those that have had most influence on the way we look at property today. And to do that, we don't need to go any further back for the present than the Enlightenment, that period of time through the 18th century when many of the current practices, both in physical outlook but also in the sciences, became established, especially in England. Lord Blackstone, writing in 1769, in his commentary on the laws of England, said that property rights are that sole and despotic dominion which one man claims and exercises over the things of the world, in total exclusion of the rights of any individual in the universe. What Lord Blackstone was doing was observing the way that property worked from a legal perspective in England in the 18th century. Hardly a theory, perhaps, but certainly a statement of the way that property rights were perceived by the law in England at that time. And certainly this anti-social aspect, the exclusion aspect, and this notion of despotism all give resonances to the notion of property that are worth giving some thought to. At about the same time that Lord Blackstone was writing, Adam Smith was considering the problem of economics and wrote his Wealth of Nations, which stands out as what is generally considered to be the first major work of modern economic thought. There have been many writings on economic thought that are pre-modern, but certainly in the English tradition, Adam Smith stands out as the major collection that started modern economic thought. And what did Adam Smith see property as? Well, first of all, Smith saw property as based ultimately on the labour that a man has himself. And so Smith saw a distinction between land property, which has got no human labour in it at all, and human labour, which Smith recognised as something which was naturally a part of the person. And so Smith was able to say that the property which every man has in his own labour, as it is the original foundation of all the other property, and so is the most sacred and inviolable. By inviolable, it means it can't be broken. And so for Smith, property is grounded in this notion of property that we see in a person owning their own labour. But he also said that the price for the use of the land is naturally a monopoly price. It is not at all proportioned to what the landlord may have laid out on the improvement of the land, or to what he can afford to take, but to what the farmer can afford to give. Now, we have to understand that Adam Smith was speaking in a time when most farmers didn't farm their own land. They effectively rented their land. And what Smith is saying here is that the fundamental principle of valuation, if you like, is that all land operates like a monopoly. And furthermore, it operates not in terms of what the landlord wants to take, but rather what the landlord can see the farmer can afford to give. And we find later on Ricardo developed this into his well-known theory of land rents, or Ricardo's law of rent. A little bit before Smith and Blackstone, we had John Locke. And John Locke's theory of property is based on the fact that if a person mixes labour, which is naturally his own property, with the land, then the result, the mixture, can't be taken away from the land, because otherwise you take away his own property. And so what that says is that if I go out and plant a crop or clear a forest and prepare some farmland or so on, the fact that my labour is in the land then as the cleared land or the planted field, that land then becomes mine. The problem for Smith and Locke when it comes to looking at property is not so much the fact that I may have an interest in land which is proportioned to the labour that I'm in it, but rather why am I justified in owning the rest of the land as well? And I'll leave this for you to think about in your own time. But ultimately what we can summarise is that modern property theory sees property as what it appears to be, whereas Indigenous people see property as what they believe it to be as a result of their Genesis stories and their spirituality. For British property, Enlightenment modern property is a monopoly right. It's also supported by the state ultimately. And so it's simply the coercive power of the state to give a private individual a monopoly right over particular rights to land, which is what property totally consists of. The Enlightenment property theory of Blackstone and Smith was quite a departure from the early English property theory that you can see in documents like the Magna Carta, which came from the 13th century. In the Magna Carta, and I recommend property people to all read it at some point, it's only a few pages long, and it's quite fascinating because of the perspective it gives on property and the importance of it in the entire culture, where not only is taxation discussed, but also things like the hereditary rights that come from property and the importance of property transferring to the right people, say through marriage and so on. But behind all that, the Magna Carta is couched in a Christian context. Christianity being the dominant religion in England in the 13th century, and in fact all through Europe, had a particular view with respect to society. And we see that coming out in the theories of property that were embodied in the property institutions of Europe at the time. Thomas Aquinas, writing also in the 13th century, observed that property was naturally common, and by that Aquinas recognised that when we're born without any particular connection to any particular piece of land. It may be that our parents own lots of land or perhaps none, but they give that to us, they pass it down not as something that we're born with, but rather than something which is communicated and acknowledged as the way that society works. And so property is naturally common. What we have, however, is a common need for property, or at least the benefits that come from property. We all need food, clothing, shelter, water, air, and so on. And all of these come from the natural environment. And so what we can say about humans is that we have a common need for access to property, but we don't have a natural connection to any particular part. The connection to particular parts of property is only conventional. Aquinas described this as what has come down to us known as the dual theory of ownership. And the dual theory of ownership that was lurking behind the property institutions of medieval Europe, and especially England, was that property can be privately owned, and in fact should be privately owned, but only so far as there is some level of common use maintained. In the feudal system, this worked because a man owning a particular piece of property, say a farmer, while he privately was able to say, this is my land, the land formally belonged to the king through the lords and so on. And so in some way, the tenant farmer, by paying rent to his lord, who eventually paid rent right the way up to the king, who supported the law and order and the army and all the rest of it, was using his property in a social way, in a way that benefited the entire community. And even the king, if we look at his ownership, while he was privately the owner of all of the land in the realm, the land was being used socially, by being used commonly by all of the intermediate lords and right down to the tenant farmer actually doing the work. And so this interplay between private ownership and common use was something that we see all through the fabric of the early Christian property theory, coming as it did from the Christian religious context. By the way, at about this time, We also see a very similar structure in property in the Islamic world, again tied with similar expectations of common obligations to the community. The early English traditions of the feudal traditions actually themselves come from earlier tribal solidarity that came from the early Germans that we'll be discussing shortly. However, the distinction between the tribal solidarity of the German tribes, the ancient German tribes, and what was happening in England in the 13th century was that the tribal solidarity, this sense of brotherhood and communication of benefits and obligations and so on across the community, were not simply applied narrowly to the tribe, they were applied universally to all humans, all people. Historically, the Germans had taken over political control from the Romans because the Romans were no longer able to man their own armies. And so the German tribal leaders became the generals of most parts of the Roman army in the early centuries AD. And while they initially introduced a narrow tribal ownership and tribal institutions, once they adopted Christianity, that tribal sense of solidarity within the tribe was then broadened to all of Christendom. And so this feudalism that came from the German tribes was a key part of re-civilizing the West by spreading a sense of solidarity and common use across the entire community. We mentioned the Germans coming in to take over the military operations of Rome. And that's because at the end of the Roman Empire, in the 3rd and 4th centuries especially, we find that Rome itself was failing as a socio-political entity. What had happened in Rome was that their property institutions had really congealed back into radical private ownership, where the ownership of immense estates was being held by a small number of extremely wealthy and influential Roman citizens. And so those Roman families who operated these large estates, known as Latifundia, largely became quite indulgent and unwilling to support the empire, and as a result the empire became basically bankrupt and short of all support. One of the things that the empire tried to do was keep its army going, but towards the end of Rome, because of the moral failure and the cultural failure, the Romans tended to become generally self-indulgent and also very cautious about contributing to the community. As a result, Romans were unwilling to serve in their own army, and this is where the Romans had to borrow soldiers from the surrounding barbarians, to the extent that most of the Roman army of the 4th and 5th century was made up of barbarian troops and barbarian leaders. Now this is really quite a distinction to early Rome, because early Rome had family-based property. The family-based property of early Rome, and here we're talking about the 3rd, 4th and earlier centuries BC, were tribal but corporate. They tended to be individual family properties or clan properties, but the inhabitants around the Tiber region, which is where the Romans came from, Latinum, tended to see themselves operating in solidarity, in some sort of a connected solidarity across the different tribes, and largely that corporate nature between the tribes was the distinguishing characteristic that enabled the Romans to be able to become the great leaders and empire builders that they were, simply because they could pick off the other tribes one by one, while they themselves were able to combine in large numbers. And this notion of national solidarity was really a key part of early Rome. And again, this is the centuries BC. By the time you get to about 150 BC, though, there was a major cultural change in Rome, And we can talk about early Rome and late Rome, distinguished around about the year 150 BC. This side of 150 BC, these enormous private estates were developing. And while there was a very small number of huge landowners, the majority of Romans were either slaves or virtual slaves, because in order to get a job, you had to be willing to work for wages that were comparable to what the landowner was paying their slaves, which was not a terrible great amount. And so this fall in the wage rate, if you like, had a major impact on late Rome. Economically, we can look back and see that it in fact crippled effective demand across the community, but the Romans weren't quite up to that kind of economic interpretation. The wealthy, on the other hand, tended to become more and more self-indulgent, self-interested, and largely corrupt, whereas the landless poor were unmotivated. They had a degree of internal solidarity, but it was only a survival solidarity. It was no longer solidarity for Rome. It was simply solidarity to keep body and soul together for me and my family. And this is where the German takeover came. Across the Roman Empire, as the Roman army became more and more German, eventually when the empire itself ceased to be a cohesive political unit, local people looked more and more to the local army leaders for leadership. And so the local garrisons of the Roman army, that just happened to be German with German leadership, took over as the local political leadership. Eventually those German generals rebadged themselves as German kings. And so in Europe we have the tradition, in folklore and elsewhere, that the kings of all of the little pocket kingdoms that we find in our fairy tales all had blonde hair and blue eyes. And that's because, unlike the majority of the population, they had German ancestry, and they are descended from these barbarian generals who became the kings. Once the Germans took over, however, it was on the back of the failure in the coordination of the Roman Empire. And so Rome ceased. We usually put the date for the end of Rome somewhere around 500 AD. And for about 300 years, between 500 AD and 800 AD, we have a rather bleak period where the German leaders were all still more barbarians than civilized, and largely the great achievements of Rome started to fall away. We find this in many, many places. For example, the Romans were able to build in concrete, but even the formula for making mortar was forgotten through the Dark Ages, making building in stone quite difficult, because you couldn't stick them together. By the time you get to 800, though, Europe was re-civilized. Largely re-civilized because the German kings, as they had become, had adopted Christianity, and Charlemagne, Charles the Great, reunited and re-civilized Europe around the year 800. In fact, on Christmas Day in the year 800, he was crowned by the Pope as Emperor of the Western Empire. And that date comes down to us today as absolutely critical, because at that point it was recognised that there was a single system of law and order spread right across Western Europe, the old Western Roman Empire. Largely today, Europe is the Western Roman Empire that comes down to us from Charlemagne. The benefits of re-civilization in Europe are immense. We can look at that in economic terms. In Charlemagne's time, say around the year 800 AD, grain production was relatively sparse. A farmer going out and sowing a field with grain would harvest less than twice the grain used, about 300 kilos per acre. However, 300 years later, that production had risen to a harvest of somewhere between 600 and 900 kilos per acre. Now, when you take away the grain which is sown, that equates to about a 300 to 500% net increase in farm productivity. So a farm was now, instead of feeding one family, it could feed 5. Those other 4 families could go off and do other things, such as write poetry or build bridges or invent scientific developments or what have you. And what we find through that period, 800 to 1100, you find tremendous rebuilding of civilization, science, technology and the arts. That level of grain production increase continued to increase up to about 1300 AD. And by 1300 AD, we had farms producing about 1,300 kilos, or about 800 to 900% increase on what was coming off farms in Charlemagne's day. That level of productivity in 1300 wasn't really increased or exceeded until the 18th century, and especially until the beginning of using artificial fertilizers. And so the level of agricultural technology, agricultural science, by the year 1300 was really quite astounding, in that it took something like 500 years of modernity to be able to exceed what they had achieved in that previous period of massive continual increase. And we find that through this period, it's good to be aware of the names and titles for these various periods in history, because often they are confused. We have the Roman Empire that ended in 500 AD. We have this brief period of 3 centuries of Dark Ages. It wasn't the only Dark Ages that the West or Europe has experienced. The Greeks experienced a Dark Age somewhere towards sort of 800 to 1,000 years BC. And it probably won't be the last Dark Age. The Dark Ages finished in 800 with Charlemagne, as we've described. That period between 800 and 1100 is known as the early medieval period, or the Middle Ages. The period between 1100 and 1500 is known as the High Medieval period, the High Middle Ages. And this medieval period needs to be distinguished from the Dark Ages. Remember, we said that in the Dark Ages they weren't able to build in stone very well because they didn't know how to make mortar. By the time we get to the High Medieval period, though, we have extraordinary developments in both the arts and the sciences. It was largely built on this combination of the solidarity that came from the Germans, mixed with the universality of Christianity. Unfortunately, from about the year 1500, that level of achievement and solidarity has been on the wane in the West, and we see it with property rights. When we go back further, we've already seen that the Romans had a almost tribal system in early Rome. How about the other ancients? Ancient property in Greece looked fairly parallel to the experience of Rome. The Greek culture and empire grew under a virtually tribal or communal property system, again based on family ownership. It was considered to be an extraordinary humiliation for a Greek family to have to part with their land to sell it. And largely the land was seen as a treasure that a family owned in order to pass it on to their children and great-grandchildren and so on. And this runs very strong parallels to indigenous people today. In ancient Greece, there was a very strong sense of family solidarity and family order. The leader of a Greek family was the patriarch, the head of the family, and the patriarch was considered as very powerful. However, the authority of the Greek patriarchs, the family leaders, while they were formally the landowner, they also had extraordinary responsibility, because it was their responsibility to care for and give the best situation possible to all of the members of their household, all of their children, and all of the other members of the family. That would include today what we would call our extended family, sisters, cousins, aunts, distant relatives, and also the other people that were within the household. In Greece they were very comfortable with slaves, and so you would have quite a lot of human bodies, all within the Greek household, all under the authority of the patriarch. However, when the Greeks moved to build city-states, the Greek cities, which were really at the time the pinnacle of cultural development and to a certain extent scientific and economic development, because you need to be fairly affluent to build a city. Cities themselves aren't very productive in an agricultural world. The Greek cities necessitated some system of private property, because what was necessary was for the cities, their inhabitants, the citizens, to be able to own property that they didn't personally farm. And that way their property wealth was then able to fund the lifestyle of the city itself. And as the Greeks developed private property to make their cities work, they found that they became, again, like the Romans, progressively more self-interested, indolent, and corrupt. In the Greeks, the Greek tradition included the development of what's come down to us as sophist thought. The Greeks were affluent at the time when they were building their cities, and as wealthy people, they were able to indulge in good education for their children. However, they chose education that taught them the things that they wanted to learn. And so they tended to hire people who would teach their children things which fitted with their corrupt, indolent and self-interested lifestyle. The teachers came along and called themselves wise men, and they were able to teach the sort of things that were able to help young Greeks turn into corrupt, indolent and self-interested grown-ups. Unfortunately, you can't have a civilization that works that way, and so ultimately the sophistry that was taught to the Greeks caused them to become very culturally weak around the 4th and 3rd centuries BC. And at about that time, as the Greeks became corrupt and self-interested, the Romans simply came in and basically took over their empire, and as they say, the rest is history. There were other ancient groups as well. We find that in many parts of the world we have various forms of what today would be seen as feudal land systems. We see this especially in what is now Turkey. We also found it in the high culture of Egypt, which was a very affluent country from ancient times. And so they used a feudal system to be able to manage and marshal their property resources, which was really the core of their economic wealth. A curious example of ancient property was the ancient Hebrew property. In the ancient Hebrew world, which was centered in Palestine, sale was permitted for land, which makes the Hebrews quite different to most of the other ancients around them. However, Hebrew law specified that while you could sell your property, once every 50 years there would be a thing called a Jubilee year. And in the Jubilee year, all debts would be cancelled and all property returned to what we today would call its traditional owners. And what that meant was that while the ancient Hebrews were permitted to sell their land, once every 50 years it returned back to its hereditary owners, the families that it belonged to. And this curious arrangement with property was able actually to provide a situation where you had private property to be able to be dealt with in the way that perhaps we would be comfortable today. However, it also, because it always returned back to the clan or the tribe or the family, had a long-term effect of not allowing the Latifundia to develop the way that it did in Rome. And so Hebrew property stands out as a curious exception that appears to be very modern, but in fact still had a very tribal foundation to it. We can find that the rules for Hebrew property are laid out fairly well in the book of Leviticus, especially in chapter 25, and the quotes are there on the slide. Ultimately, the Hebrew people, like most ancients, were a tribal people. They saw themselves as God's chosen people, in the same way that indigenous people see themselves as particularly picked out by their creation story to have a particular relationship with the land. The ancient Hebrews also saw themselves as the chosen people of God, being able to apply different laws to themselves compared to people that were not of their tribe, which they called Gentiles. And we have this distinction coming down to us today in the modern Jewish tradition, which still maintains a fairly strong distinction between Jews and Gentiles. But it did mean that the ancient Hebrews were able to practice a strong form of internal solidarity, and this was able to keep their culture very strong and cohesive down through the ages. In this very rapid waltz through the history of property, what we've seen is that the modern property of Blackstone and Smith, this despotic monopolistic right, actually grew out of traditions that were very different. The Christian solidarity of the medieval era, the Greek and Roman solidarity of the early clans that tended to be corrupted as those cultures walked off the stage of history, the tribal Germans who had a system of property which modern indigenous people would be very comfortable with, and likewise the ancient Hebrew people. But today we have private property, radical private property, not the mixed or dual theory of property that comes from thinkers such as Aquinas and the traditions of the medieval era. The modern theory of private property, which really grew from about the 16th century, from roughly about the year 1500, when, especially in England, Henry VIII established large amounts of radical private property or absolute private property, when he gave land freehold to his supporters instead of the leasehold or the feudal obligations. Freehold is simply the feudal grant of land, but without the feudal obligations, and hence the notion of freehold. And in the succeeding few centuries, the 16th century up to the 18th century especially, generally the development of private property in the West has also come parallel with a high level of polarisation of wealth. And in a country like England, where it's simultaneously becoming very commercially and economically wealthy over that period, the polarisation of wealth means that a relatively small part of the society, a landed part and so on, were doing very well out of the Industrial Revolution, out of property, out of the English Empire. However, the majority of Englishmen weren't doing very well at all. And we see some of the evidence of this in the way that, especially in the 18th century, the time of Blackstone and Smith, many people had to steal even trivial things in order to survive. And so we hear stories of people stealing apples or a loaf of bread or something to be able to live themselves or possibly be able to feed their brothers or sisters or children. And for their efforts, for their theft, at that time they were sent into prison, and when the prisons filled up, they were sent to penal colonies, such as many of the parts of Australia, especially New South Wales and Tasmania. And so we have this evidence of excess of the absolute private property, which came into the West from about the year 1500 onwards and was largely accepted theoretically in the 18th century. But it was causing considerable problems. And there was at first some reaction to it, some rebellion. That didn't work terribly well because of the power that rested in the hands of the landowners. However, the extremity of the need and also the level of organisation of the disenfranchised, those who were landless, was so great that through the 19th century we have what now comes down to us as the socialist rebellion. And we can understand socialism as the reaction to the excesses of capitalism. That's not to say that capitalism or the free market is necessarily an evil thing. However, it certainly has the capacity, and history has shown that it has exercised that capacity on a number of occasions. It has this capacity to do considerable evil within a society. The 19th century socialist rebellion was really a rejection of the wealth polarisation, and it was focused particularly on the matter of property. An early socialist by the name of Pierre-Joseph Proudhon in the early 19th century came out with an expression, very simple and still is used as a catch-cry amongst certain anarchists today: property is theft. Not a good line if you're a property economist. To some extent, Proudhon was reacting to the circumstances as he saw them in his time. Proudhon, no doubt, was an excessive reaction, probably formed partly because of the turmoil following from the French Revolution. A little later on, we have Karl Marx taking Proudhon's ideas further. Marx would see that the surplus value from a man's labour was taken away from him through the process of capitalism. And Marx identified this theft of the surplus value of labour being taken away from the labourer, that is, taken away from its natural owner, as being the result of the institution of property. And so from that, Marx concluded, quite simplistically, that if theft was resulting from the institution of property, then the institution of property must be taken away, must be broken down in some way. Marx had an elaborate theory of human nature and human relationship and so on, which has come down to us in sociology as what's known as conflict theory, which is a rather dismal theory that suggests that every social relationship that we ever have is based on conflict. My inclination to want to fight you, and that makes up every relationship, whether it's in the family or in the society or in business. Applied to property, Marx saw that if people were given the weapon of property, they would use it in this conflict-based world to oppress and exploit other people. And so the solution was communism. It was to take private property and vest it in the hands of the state, because it was only when it was held by the community that, at least as far as Marx's view went, it would then be dealt with reasonably. The results of Proudhon and Marx and others of their ilk was that there were a number of major revolutions, and even more importantly, the fear of revolution in other free states. The evidence that comes down from those countries that have adopted communism hasn't been very flattering to the whole communist enterprise. While the revolutions worked for some time, largely we can see that they were never economic successes, and they relied heavily on political suppression and exploitation and so on. They were really ideological excesses in the opposite direction, and largely their economic failures. However, the fear of revolution was something that spread far beyond the boundaries and the borders of those countries that suffered communist revolutions, to the extent that countries like Germany and England were afraid that because of their excesses in capitalism, their majority population who were impoverished would take up armed rebellion and overthrow the political system. And as a result of that, there has been a major reduction in wealth polarisation over much of the last century or century and a half or so, to the extent that if we look at the level of wealth polarisation, say in the year 1800, it was considerably higher, almost immeasurably higher, than it was in the year 1950. Unfortunately, with the political failure of most communist regimes, especially from the 1980s onwards, there has been a dilution of this effect of the fear of revolution, causing the free states to legislate and operate in a way to minimise wealth polarisation. And so we can see the beginnings of that tendency coming back into our culture in the present era in time. One of the curiosities of communism and socialism is that, like capitalism, it's built on a theory of the world which is entirely material. In other words, it assumes that there is nothing that exists that you can't see, touch, smell, you can't sense with your senses. It's a material scientific world that we live in today. And largely that works very well for us because it gives us considerable advances in science and technology. But it's really that assumption which lies at the basis of our culture, say unlike the spiritual foundation that lied at the base of Christian medieval period, or perhaps the spirituality that lies behind the indigenous groups that we are looking at today, or perhaps the ancients back in their tribal eras. So what we can say is that while communism looks very, very different to capitalism in terms of what it says about property and many other things. At its core, it's very similar to capitalism because it's built on the same Genesis story, the same idea of what exists in the world, and that is that everything is purely material.